to this last seminar in the Beyond GDP sort of theme we had in the Complex Systems Center this year. So I see some new faces. I'm Henk Dijkstra, I'm the current director of this center. And we had two teams, very different teams. One was the Beyond GDP, the other one was neural differential, ordinary differential equations, so machine learning, technically oriented. And we're glad that Auke sort of will give this talk. There's a growing interest also from complex system scientists in this problem, how to define the broad well-being. Actually, yesterday we had a meeting with people from SCP and KBL and say the CPD to discuss this, more the quantitative aspects. Auke will give me all the historical background. So he is an assistant professor at the economic and social history group, right, at the university. He got his PhD in 2012, also at the EU and on the guidance of Bas van Babel. And we're looking forward to the talk.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to click on the understand if it's being recorded. Topic today is GDP and well-being in the world economy since 1820, and indeed it's very much in line with beyond GDP debates in policy circles, but also academic circles. And I wanted to also briefly introduce myself to give a bit of context where I'm coming from, though I think Henk has already covered a few of these points, but I think the important bit is that I'm an economic historian, so what I do is that we try to reconstruct past economies, understand how they function, and how they perform. So that's sort of the angle that we're coming from. And personally, I'm very interested in the question of what this looks like where you don't take economic output as your main indicator to look at, but rather look at well-being. So are these economies, are these societies making the people living in them better? Okay. Let's see. Okay. All right, and so then a little bit of introduction and motivation as to where I'm coming from. And so I want to explain a bit about how my field looks at these issues, and it's a bit of a strange story maybe. So I would say traditionally, economic history has sort of not really had this GDP focus, so there wouldn't really be a terrible need to go beyond GDP. So if you look at some of the older literature, you see a very big focus on topics like what we call biological standard of living. So that's things like mortality or stature, so human height. So if you're willing to assume that that is a consequence of nutrition during childhood, this is an interesting way to look at living standards. And for example, there's lots of source material on this, for example, from conscription records. And likewise, the archives, which is where we do our most, depending a bit on what your exact focus is, but in the archives you'll find plenty of historical account books, just people keeping track of finances, institutions keeping track of finances. And they pay wages to people, so you can see what people earn. But sort of the weird thing in our field is that somewhere in the late 1990s, there were a couple of very important contributions by someone named Angus Madison, who made these reconstructions of the world economy. These, I think, were important in two ways. One is that they were just very exciting and interesting contributions, right? He was did a lot of hard work and was able to say things about how much growth was there in the world economy and how was it distributed over periods like 200 years. And the second reason it's very important is that some of the assumptions he had to do to get there also became the topic of hot debate, right? Like, do we really know what GDP in country X in something like 1850 was? To sort of see coming that the answer is sometimes yes, but quite often this is very difficult. But the consequence was a bit that this became a big flagship project of the field with lots of efforts at standardization to basically start doing something which we call historical national accounting. So make historical GDP estimates. And I think it is fair to say that as a result of this, sort of the importance of GDP as a yardstick of long-term progress has really increased in the field since these contributions. Right, and now we're slowly going to sort of move away from the inside baseball of the field and try to go to slightly more general things. Right, I would say this is a bit unfortunate, and it's not just me saying that, right? There's a lot of people who are concerned about the focus on GDP, and I think if you visited one or two other of these seminars, you'll have heard some of these things before, right? The two big ones are that GDP completely ignores distributional issues, right? This is not what it's interested in. It's either a total of production or a total of production divided over the number of people in a country to get GDP per capita. So how it's distributed, it just doesn't tell us. And also very important is that GDP is not suited to measure the contributions of non-market goods and services to well-being, right? Here's a list of some of the things like health, education, security, governance, and an example I tend to quite like here is working hours. So if you look at GDP, right, if people work more, this is in any way it's going to be good, right? More production, so you get a higher number, and this would be good. But of course, it is quite reasonable to assume that maybe some people would like to work less, right? In the Netherlands, we are sort of champions at part-time work, which is maybe part with tax incentives and these sort of things, but also in part the real preference of people. But GDP would always say that this is bad, less hours worked, less production, so bad. And in fact, it's double bad, because if you work less and work more and put your child in childcare, a service, namely childcare, which was previously outside of the figures because it's produced at home in the informal sector, and then you bring it to a nursery, which is in the GDP statistics. So then it's actually double good. And there's lots of issues like this. And so I think sort of the short one is that whether an economy or society functions well, we need to know more than just how much it produces. And so if our field moves to, or if GDP per capita becomes dominant in a field like economic history, you're not giving a complete picture. Okay, and then sort of the final bit of context, which is kind of the starting point for a lot of research on this topic, and also what's been a starting point for a lot of my research on this topic, is a collaboration to sort of address this issue together with the OECD. So roughly around the same time, we as a field were concerned about this, and roughly around this time, and probably also one of the reasons we started thinking more about this, is a set of changes in public and policy debates to sort of landmark publications there. It was called the Stiglitz, Sen, and Fitoussi report, and there's also a very big and wordy document from the European Commission from the same year, 2009, who were all about explaining these issues with GDP and what you could do instead. And roughly at the same time as well, the OECD initiated something they call the Better Life Initiatives. Better Life Initiative and a set of reports, biannual they are, called How's Life. And the basic goal here is to inform governments, statistical agencies, how to do well-being measures. I was part of a team of economic historians which sort of tried to jump on that hype train, if you will know. We thought there was a valuable collaboration to be made there by trying to add a historical dimension to this project, basically having as a goal to quantify developments in well-being since 1820. So this resulted in a set of reports into 2014 and 2021. And from this, many sort of spin-off projects came, right? So those of you who are at the Utrecht University will sometimes see the broader well-being index make an appearance in the newsletter. This is a collaboration with the Rabobank, which is also, I think, a spin-off from this project, right? This was, we were quite happy with how this went and the sort of impact it had. So we continued along those lines. And what I want to do over the remainder of my time is to highlight sort of some of the findings from 3 lines of research which came from these reports. So one is sort of a pretty descriptive, but I think still interesting picture about what progress and inequality in the world economy look like, both in terms of GDP and well-being. And then 2 sort of slightly more in-depth topics, and we'll see how far we get in terms of time, is to look at something we call coupling and decoupling between well-being and GDP over time. And this is maybe a bit of an unfortunate term because lots of other fields sort of also use these terms. So there's some scope for confusion there, but we still haven't found a better one. This is basically the question about, how much do we need additional productivity, additional material output, GDP, to increase well-being, which I think, given current constraints on growth for various reasons, is a pretty important question. Final one is this question whether you can make a single number to measure well-being if you don't want to look just at GDP. Okay, so whilst I've been saying that we should look less at GDP, I first do want to look at what is sort of the broad picture in GDP developments over a very long period, for a few reasons, right? One is that this does give some constraints to what is possible in terms of well-being achievements as well, but also because, while I'm saying that the dominance of GDP is a bit unfortunate, a lot of interesting and valuable work has been done along the lines of the Madison agenda, and it is just interesting to see what this picture looks like. So first, I just want to highlight the developments in a couple of countries for which we have pretty good statistics, and yeah, you can look at a graph like this, I think, in two ways. One is that even some of the most developed countries in the world economy, like Britain and the Netherlands, were still incredibly poor and consistently poor for a very long time. And then somewhere around the 19th century, there's a change, and then suddenly you get a lot of economic growth. We as economic historians tend to also really zoom in on the particulars, right? So what sort of developments are happening here, and can how certain are we about these things? How does these economies operate? But sort of the real big picture is, I think, to look at the huge differences over time. Another thing which is kind of interesting to do in terms of this, and sort of also to serve as a contrast for things we'll be looking at later, is to see how, on average, GDP per capita develops in the various regions of the world economy. So we divide the world in 8 regions, which are not sort of the traditional continents and subcontinents, but more sort of what we like to think about coherent economic or cultural regions, and calculate a population-weighted GDP per capita in all these regions. And one of the sort of striking patterns that you see there is the degree of divergence between the regions of the world and the sort of inequality this implies, right? So you see that in Western Europe and what we call the Western offshoot, so that's like Canada, the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, right, so growth really starts in the 19th century, and especially in sort of the very strong growth years post World War II, they really take off. Whereas you see quite a lot of other regions, like Sub-Saharan Africa, of course, is a very familiar example, but also South and Southeast Asia, especially sort of what India really started developing. Growth is far slower and they are far nearer to subsistence income levels. So this also implies very big discrepancies between the regions of the world. All right. What I want to do next is see what this picture looks like if we move to a set of well-being indicators that we can track over a pretty long time. And so what we tried to do in the How Was Life books was to fit the well-being measurement framework that the OECD developed for their Better Life initiative and try to map them to things which we can historically measure. And sometimes that is very doable, right? So there's something like income and wealth, which, well, especially on income, we can get pretty good statistics, and also on things like health status, if you will look at that in terms of mortality, again, we can get pretty good statistics. And sometimes it's far harder. Something like subjective well-being, which is typically just a survey concept, right? So considering your life overall, how are you doing, right? We can't travel back in time and ask people. And we played around a bit with looking at proxies like suicide statistics, but this is just, that just basically didn't work for reasons I'm very happy to dive into, but that I will point out. So the next 6 slides or so are looking at the various chapters in these How Was Life books, which is neatly pointed out on top, also recognize the hard work which went into that, and see what that looks like and contrast it what we see in terms of GDP. Okay, and so if you look at something like real wages, which is just wages corrected by a consumer price index, what you can actually buy for them, you see pretty similar patterns, right? So very strong growth in the developed West or the global North, right? Whichever term you want to use for it. You also see lots of gaps in the data, by the way, which is again lots of inside baseball here, which I'm happy to go into. Whereas in other regions, right, again, especially if you look at regions like South and Southeast Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, wage levels are just far lower. Okay, we can also look at something like income inequality, where one thing you can already see is that this becomes very noisy compared to the other measures, which by itself is already very interesting, and also that it tends to be not have a very high trend, right? So if you look at something like developments in Western Europe, which we know pretty well, right? So for a while it trends down, it's pretty noisy, but in recent years you do also really see a strong uptake, increase in income inequality. So it's far harder to already see clear patterns and clear divergences.
Can I ask a question on this?
Of course, yes.
So to what extent is the noisiness here due to the phenomenon itself or due to the quality of the data?
So that depends on which half of the graph you look at. So generally, so at a very general level, just income inequality is hard to measure, right? If you take things like, are you going to look at individuals, pre-tax, post-tax, households? This already makes it quite complicated. But then, for example, if you look at like the second half, let's say post 1950 or sort of post 1914, when we get a decent grip on this thanks to the statistics of national income taxes, right? So this U-shaped pattern of a strong decline followed by an uptake in more recent decades is reproduced in quite a few regions and feels pretty solid. Though, you know, if you really want to dive into it, there's plenty of quibbling about this as well. So if you look at the period before 1900, it's far harder to get solid data, right? There are very few national income taxes which just basically tell you for everybody, give you at least a crude number of what they earn. So you take some partial data, you start working with proxies, and to get those all aligned and harmonized is And so if you want to take something very, very specific out of it, like, so is this really happening? I would frankly say we don't really know. I would very much be inclined to sort of fit like a very crude curve to this and say that roughly works. But this, yeah.
So what are the gray, are the different estimates, the gray curves?
No, okay, so this is good to explain. Right, so the gray just basically gives all the regions, right? So let me find a good example, right? So let's see what's the, like, okay, Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, right? So they are the lowest curve everywhere. So they're just to help make the comparisons with the other regions clear. Okay, so that maybe needed some explanation where clear is.
You could have seen that actually.
Some explanation there was. Right. Okay, so we can also look at what I mentioned earlier, right? Our field has a rich tradition of looking at human heights, basically as partially as, you know, we have to work with what we have, and we have lots of conscription records. But I think it is also a very interesting measure by itself, right? So nutrition issues during childhood are results in stunting, and you can pick this up when you measure your conscripts age 18.
But that means it's mostly male height.
Yeah, these are pretty much exclusively male heights, but yes, good. All right, but I kind of want to emphasize 2 points here, right? I think one thing you see here is just pretty substantial progress in these indicators as well, right? So there's been a lot of GDP growth, but there's also been a lot of growth in these measures of human heights. Another thing which I find striking, and that we'll find as 2 more slides going forward, is that this pattern of almost flatlining, so this divergence between West, developed West and the rest is still there, right? If you look at something like South and Southeast Asia compared to these other regions, right? So heights in these regions are just higher, which should be an indicator of how well nourished people were. But overall, the degree of divergence in these figures. You can also calculate this by, for example, calculating standard deviations over time, and then the difference is really pretty obvious. Right, one where I think you can see this best, where this pattern is really most striking, is in terms of life expectancy. Right, where in the earliest periods, pretty much everywhere where we have data, right, average life expectancy is just extremely low, sort of low 30s, which basically means, right, very high infant mortality. And if you make it past age 1, right, you're not going to turn like 70 or 80 like you do now. So very low life expectancy. And indeed, you see also that, like in Western Europe and the Western offshoots, this is sort of the place where this first really starts to change. That's by the end of the 19th century. Society really started to get a grip on their disease environment. But the most interesting thing, what is really specific, is that given a certain lag, if you're willing to wait a couple of decades, right, you see that all the regions in the world basically start joining this trend. And why this could be, I have one slide about that later. Right, and so this is just another case where this sort of clear divergence, as you see in more material indicators, income and productivity indicators, just cannot be found. You also see some interesting reversals, right? So like what happens in life expectancy in the former Soviet Union is, I think, also a well-known theme, but very clearly shows up. Right, another one that we can say a few things about is political openness here, right? So is a country a democracy? Do people get a say in their governance? Right, where the basic story is that this is again just there are no real clear trends here, clear divergences, just way more noisy. Okay, so something you can also do, which I'll talk about at the end of the talk, is try and make a composite indicator of these trends. And if you do that, you sort of confirm the picture we saw a bit earlier, namely that progress is more widely shared, so you don't get these huge divergences, and progress is also more stable. Okay, right here are some bullet points that basically kind of summarize those points, right? So there is, if you look at all these indicators, right, I think I tend to focus on where does this relation between GDP and well-being kind of break down, and you know what are sort of the interesting exceptions to the trend and where the things were differently. But I also think it is important to just point out that along quite a big range of all these indicators, right, you can see very substantial progress over 200-year period in quite a few dimensions. Right, there are also a few dimensions like inequality and political openness where the trends are less clear, and you can just have pretty strong reversals as well. All right, and yeah, this point about inequality, right? If you look at the material side of things, differences between regions in the world are huge. If you look at other dimensions, health in particular, the story is different. Okay, what I want to do over the next couple of slides is look at this this question about what is the relation between these two aspects of well-being, right? So gross domestic product, maybe as a measure of material progress, which you could also say enables progress along lots of other indicators, and a number of these individual well-being indicators. And I'm going to do that along with a number of different methods, all pretty similar, but all giving a slightly different angle at the same issue. And I think one of the striking things, sort of already to preempt a bit what I'm going to conclude as well, is that it's hard to really come to a clear conclusion about this. So I'm very interested also to hear, you know, what you think when you see this, what sort of questions that raises, and what sort of conclusions you would draw. Okay, so the very first thing we tried to do was basically do something pretty simple, namely calculate a correlation coefficient with the cross section of GDP and all these well-being indicators for various moments of time. So we take the 1820 cross-section, 1830, all the way to these series run to 2000. Okay, and two things for me here kind of stand out. One is that while there are like exceptions, right, that we also talked about earlier, overall, if you look at these dimensions, you see positive correlations, right? So as GDP goes up, you would expect these other indicators to go up as well. But there is also one interesting recurring pattern, which is sort of that this correlation at what we tend to call the start of the growth process, right? So roughly around the turn of the 18th to 19th century, a number of economies in the world really start growing at a faster pace. Is that you see that these correlations at the start, they're harder to measure, right? We have fewer observations, the observations are noisier, so if you calculate the confidence interval around that, they're pretty wide, but they're also lower, right? So they grow to a higher point. So you see this for life expectancy, you see this for the political openness measures, for the human heights measures, to a lesser degree for the real wage series, right? So that's an interesting pattern, which I'll have a bit more to say about just a bit. Okay, something else we try to do, let's see what comes up next, yes, okay, is calculate something which is known in our sort of little corner of the world as a Preston curve, which is again for cross sections to try and fit a line to the relationship between per capita GDP and whatever well-being indicator you're interested in. And so Preston very famously did this for life expectancy and sort of saw even in very early data that this curve sort of shifts up. And how to interpret that is again something we'll come return to in just a bit. And what we tried to do was see if you could see a similar phenomenon for different well-being indicators. And we first just tried to do this visually, right? Just chop up the data and plot all the curves over each other. But what you sort of notice is that it just becomes a bit hard to read. I see some squinting in the audience, which is also to do with the size of the graphs. But one way of sort of trying to capture that is to basically estimate a simple regression, right? We have a well-being indicator, which we basically try to predict from GDP per capita, a lot of GDP per capita, and we calculate an intercept separately for each sub-period. And the basic idea is that this period-specific intercept then gives some sort of well-being residual that we cannot account for due to GDP, the level of increases in GDP per capita. And if we plot that over time, so we hope we sort of get an indication of sort of what sort of shifts in this curve exist and what sort of what we need to explain. Right, I think again the most interesting one and the clearest pattern can be seen, one we already pointed out, which is what you see happen with life expectancy, where sort of this unaccounted component keeps increasing. And what is sort of the one of the suggestions what's going on there is that this is the spread of healthcare technology throughout the world, right? So once invented, antibiotics or things like that are not very expensive to produce, and you can get them across the world, and likewise sort of non-medical interventions. Once you know how they work, vaccinations also very important. And so these give these life expectancy gains, which will become independent of increases in GDP per capita. And I think what would be very nice is if these sort of patterns existed for lots of indicators, because that would mean that well-being can improve, even though maybe growth slows down. And then the question is, can you see that? I would say the answer is sort of, well, that's sort of where I get like clear conclusions are kind of hard to come by. The patterns are, I would say, ambiguous, right? So you can point at various things in data, right? So we have these political openness indicators where you see very specific things, right? So after the fall of the wall, you see a lot of these former Eastern European countries turn into democracies, even though their GDPs are dropping quite substantively. So then you get these sort of positive boosts. But then at the same time, sort of in the 60s and 70s, you saw a lot of countries move into dictatorships. And yeah, you can sort of fit a story to each little bit of the curve, but it's no clear story like you see here, right? With education, maybe there's a story there. Yes, please.
So you model it here in every case like this indicator is dependent on GDP.
Yeah.
But there are some cases where it's also plausible that the relationship is the other way around.
Yeah, definitely.
Education is the most
That's
suspect there, I guess.
Yeah, no, So I think really for education, that is clearly a very plausible scenario, right? As you invest in education, people can become more productive, have more sophisticated roles in the economy, and you could get growth. But sort of even more tricky thing is that in this case, I would also say it probably works both ways, right? You also need a government budget and demand for skills to invest in education in the first place, right? And I think, education is really the big one where this is. You could probably also argue, right, if you call this democracy, right? So how does that relationship work? Is it growing incomes make countries become more democratic, or is it the other way?
Also only 5 data arguments. It's an indicator of a more peaceful society.
Yeah. Also,
Easier to produce them.
Yeah, no, so yeah, we can't say any, I mean, we don't even try to say something about what direction the causality is here. And I think also in quite a few cases, it would be very hard to ever find out, right? So this point about which way does it run, right? Democracy or growth is.
But that implies that you could do this, so some of these graphs also the other way around.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, did you try to run separate regressions for before and after the Second World War? Because I mean, what you're doing now is to is to fit a line through the cloud of points, GDP and these indicators. But the relation is very much nonlinear for, well, okay, it's log GDP, but still you do get, a kink around the 1950 there. And I guess that this unexplained component, which is the interest of them, kind of change.
No, so that's a very good question. And in other versions of this story, we did try this to also have a varying coefficient. It wasn't this 2-period split, which I think is quite interesting to look at as well, right? We tried to just have it vary dynamically over the entire period. It maybe might not surprise you that sort of makes it very hard to estimate, especially in the earlier periods. And yeah, I would say it is potentially if you fit it over the entire curve, and so over the entire cloud, and so you are sort of squashing together different experiences. It is, I think, due to the fact that the weight of the data is in the post-1870, but especially in the post-1950 period, right? That's when you start getting far more countries as these colonial empires break down, and there's basically you get complete statistics from statistical agencies on lots of these indicators. So I would say it is the entire cloud, but the cloud is sort of very post-World War II heavy, which I think makes it
I thought these regressions are already fit per year, right, or per period.
No, so it's one line. It's one slope, and just different intercepts. So you can also think of it like we have dummies for each decade.
Yeah, just if you have any reasoning why the life expectancy and the stature is going first down before it goes up, is it due to industrializations and the workers working under horrible conditions there, or what is?
Yeah, pretty much. So that's these are actually sort of this downward part of these trends. This is all a lot noisier, but it's going on in these wage series as well, and also in these stature series. It's a very interesting problem, especially in the early industrializing countries. So Britain and Belgium, I think, are the most well-known examples. Is that you see life expectancy going down considerably, mortality increasing substantially. You also see heights decreasing in these countries. Education also runs back. And it's a mix of things, right? So for the life expectancy, probably the urbanization is a very big part of the problem, right? These cities really boom, but the people governing them don't really know how to control the disease environment. So every couple of years you get a cholera epidemic, and mortality really increases. The idea with these sort of developments in stature and real wages are part stories about child labor, and also part stories about growing inequality at the start of the industrialization process. So it's basically the rich getting richer, but the laborers either not sharing in the gains or even.
Yeah, maybe related to that, is there also, did you try to correlate like the GDP growth in one country with indicators in another? So thinking of if you like positive or negative externalizations of impact when you have workers now in other countries which are exploited, so maybe you have negative impacts there, but then the GDP growth is only from the country where the companies belong to or something like this.
So as you can tell from my face, no, we really didn't try that yet, and I'm sort of thinking a bit about the degree whether this is going to be possible. So I am going to say it is I think a very interesting possibility, right? So I think a key story of the which anecdotes am I going to pick out? So I think two are quite interesting.
You could even do it within a country, like in the Netherlands, Groningen, with the earthquakes due to the gas exploration. Perhaps the well-being there is going down for like 3 centuries, 3 millennia. Well, the GDP, because of the gas exploration, has been positively impacted.
Yeah, that's also definitely a possibility, right? And so I mentioned this broader well-being index research, where you do always see that the northeast of Groningen performs very poorly on all these indicators. And yeah, if you then go back internationally, right, there's sort of 2 interesting stories. There's the Dutch colonial empire. Very interesting one. So for a pretty long time, roughly 1830 to 1870, 1880-ish, a very exploitative system called the cultivation system, basically forced labor in coffee and sugar plantations, which if you track some of, especially for example, we in a different paper looked at mortality among the population there, but you can also other indicators. Indonesia, it's hard to get data for the 19th century, but it's pretty commonly real. It was a very exploitative system that the peasants of Indonesia really suffered under. Whereas of course the Netherlands sort of a nice regular annual infusion, which paid for quite a lot of the infrastructure investments in the country. So I think like something like the Amsterdam Rijnkanaal, don't quote me on this, was to a large extent funded by things like that. So these interdependencies definitely exist. Whether it's going to be possible to pick them up in data, which I'm sort of proud for the field for everything that's there, but they're also quite noisy. So lots of conjectures and estimates where you want super solid data, but you have what you have. But I would definitely think the mechanism is at play. I'm kind of looking at the time. I want to say I'm going to skip 2 or 3 of them.
Yeah,
Say one
5 minutes or so.
Yeah, and then give some time for some overall questions. So this was a slightly different way of looking at the same thing, right? What if you just predict these well-being developments according to such a simple model, and then just look at how they trace. But just some sort of in-between conclusions, right? So one of the things I briefly mentioned in response to a question was this idea of an early growth paradox, is that the early industrializing countries got some GDP growth, but basically either the laboring masses, to put it in big old-fashioned terms, either didn't share or even suffered to make that happen. I've misspelled interbellum, which is very sloppy. But interesting is that in this period, actually, you have some evidence for the inverse paradox, right? So these are the 30s, and economies worldwide take a nosedive, but you see pretty steady progress along quite a lot of indicators in this story. Okay, two more things to point out is, right, this is a very similar story, right? You see a strong correlation between GDP and all these other indicators, but it's definitely not perfect. And one thing I want to point out is that in all these stories, we took proportional changes in per capita GDP as sort of our predictor. Right, so you're saying like a 10% or 1% increase or a 10% increase in per capita GDP would predict these changes in well-being indicator. So that of course has a bit of an implication that if you want to follow this correlation forward and you want to have even more well-being by just increasing GDP, you need more proportional increases, right? So you need to like double global GDP again, which whether that's really feasible is a question for another talk. I want to say one final thing, which is about construction and debates surrounding what are called composite indicators of well-being. So what you kind of noticed in the story that of the past 10 slides or so is that there were all these different well-being indicators, and you look at the hop from one to the other and sort of hope a consistent picture rolled out so you can clearly have a very clear conclusion. Of course, the world doesn't actually work that way, right? If you sort of start with this idea, okay, well-being has many aspects, it's multidimensional, and you need to look at all of them, which is, I think, something you can get most people to agree on. Then very quickly you run into this story, right? The different indicators show different things. Now, what are we going to conclude? Yeah, are we going to try and create this one single composite indicator, or are we going to stick to a dashboard? And yeah, really the pro is, right, you have this long complicated story. If you can agree on how to create an index like that, you can really simplify it, which I think would be very valuable, but you can see the con coming, right? There is really not just any agreement on how this should be done. And I'm going to skip over some details, but together with Bas and Robin, another colleague, we took a look at this debate of the use of these indicators in our field to sort of see, what's even going on, what sort of consensus is there, and what sort of things are being used, and where are the issues. And to skip over some details, you had a contribution there, which basically claimed, okay, look, if you look at all these things which are being used, and you look at sort of what they assume about substitutability between the indicators, right? So can you exchange some income for some health, or is that something we're not going to allow, or do we just want to make it difficult? And there's a couple of other them. And their basic point was, right, if you do that, if you look at that and you sort of allow lots of choices in these parameters, you get what they say is that anything goes, right? So like any story about an economy, the names, it will not surprise you, they're talking about the Italian economy, that you can tell lots of stories about what the development there was in the past 150 years. So I'm going to skip a graph here, but I think two kind of interesting things do happen here, which I think sort of mean we shouldn't give up on trying to make these composite indicators, even though it's very difficult to get consensus, and sort of the choices in how you create an index like that can have pretty substantial impact on the story you end up telling. And that is 2 points here, right? Is actually that in the literature you actually see far more consensus than the critics typically argue, right? So the critics will say you can just choose different things here and you get completely different stories. But we would say sort of one of the things the review shows is that sort of within the field there's some consensus about how you should actually end up doing this. And another is that if you look at a set of these indicators, right, while there are different stories, there is also a core of fairly high correlations, which makes these trends you in at least at a high aggregation level, like the world economy, pretty more robust than you would maybe think. You would basically reproduce a story like I did earlier, right? So you always see substantial progress on this 200-year period. And that progress in well-being is just more or less uneven you see in terms of material progress. And yeah, that said, there are interesting growth paradoxes which you could explore. And that's also the conclusion.
Thank you. So there were already some discussions and some questions, but anyone? Yeah.
So you say that the key arguments for making one composite index is simplification. But why would we want to simplify that? Why would we do with such an index?
So I think maybe if you look at it from just okay, I'm going to give 2 reasons. So one is to sort of not look at it from the academic perspective, right? Where maybe the correct conclusion is just you need lots of different indicators to track this, and just deal with it, right? That's the hand you're dealt, and you need to look at many of them at the same time. That's sort of when you try to translate it to policy, the story kind of changes, right? So then you're trying to compete with a very nice and simple story, which, for example, is told by GDP per capita, or if you take the Dutch case, right, the CPB, Central Planning Agency. I don't think that's what they call themselves in English, but bear me out, right? You get these purchasing power projections in response to electoral programs, right? And they really, in the media, it just really becomes condensed to a single number. And if you try to compete with that by saying, well, we have 15 different numbers, you sort of already, you're a step behind in the debate. And of course, another issue is that, and that should bring me to the second one, is then if you hand over all these indicators for someone to draw a conclusion, right? So what's the state of the country? What should we do? You still need to end up making choices, right? So I think throughout this talk, I really at some points highlighted life expectancy is a very important indicator to keep track of what's going on. But yeah, that's not a principled, systematic reason for doing that. It's just that it shows a very clear trend. We feel pretty good about the data, but you end up making a choice anyway. You want to be systematic and very clear about why you do that and the assumptions.
So I was arguing that making these choices actually becomes harder if you lump everything into a real number. And in the case of purchasing power, for example, there's a coherent theoretical model behind it that highlights whether it's accurate or not. When it highlights the mechanisms behind it. If you lump everything into one number, there's no theoretical basis for that. It becomes very difficult to make like actionable policy based on these mechanisms.
Yeah. So I think I like 99% agree, right? It becomes way harder, and it's very easy to make a choice which in some subtle way is actually misleading and sort of theoretical frameworks, right? Some of these indicators have just basically no theoretical framework, right? There's dozens to choose from, but quite a few of them basically have almost no theoretical framework. But sort of my argument would be is that the alternative is not that we then all agree on, okay, so purchasing power we should go for because that has to be a framework. It's that then we end up doing something with a dashboard anyway. And then we don't think about how hard this really is at all. So it's more like a challenge, right? So you do it this way. And I think sort of the whole, right, it's really inside baseball, this Amendola debate, right? This is not a paper you have read or will read because you have your own reading list, right? But they really show, right? So we have people in literature, they do with that. And if we follow these theoretical assumptions, sort of, what are you actually saying about these, about welfare and well-being according to these indices? And the results are very surprising and sometimes also very well, uncomfortable. That's a big word, but you know, you see them and say, okay, we can't assume that. That's a weird thing. The same, so they drive you to say, okay, then if we don't want to do that, then what should we do? But you know, at the same time, you should not expect like, oh, we'll just come up with a good theoretical framework, and we'll report back in a year, and we'll have your answer. Right? It's very hard.
Do people agree on what data have to be collected to do it properly in the future? Establish these relationships, and is those data, is it monitored?
Sorry, the last bit.
Is that data also monitored? I mean, is there an effort to do that?
So it's going to be a bit of a yes and no answer. I would say that if you look, right, there's, like I said, there's quite a few of these, and they're called frameworks, which is sort of like a way of saying we don't have a very clear theory about how we should do this framework. But you do again see, if you look at the empirical literature, considerable overlap. But this overlap to a degree is also due to, it's very easy to add a thing, right? It's like we have 9 now, we have people saying we should have 10, that's just added. So you do see a consensus, but that's just because it's easy, to a degree, because it's easy to keep adding.
Yeah, but you have to collect it also.
Yeah.
So it adds to the effort.
Yeah, and here's, I think,
Right. You would like to know whether it's relevant, right? Well.
Yeah, I mean, in our field, we're also just very data constrained, right? So some things we're just never going to find out because they're just not, there's no records, and we can't just go out and collect it, and so that really limits it as well. And yeah, the degree to which data collection is being monitored, it's a hard one to say, right? So, like in the Netherlands, Statistics Netherlands made this proper well-being monitor, and it's a very long one, lots of indicators, and they've taken for some. That's also some commitment to keep collecting this data. But at the same time, you do also see, right, this is also a big part of this is things we were collecting anyway. If you were to sort of put it differently, like, okay, we take this beyond critique seriously, we take a lot of step back and think systematically about what we should gather, and then set up all new programs and commit to that, that's maybe different.
Okay, any last question? Yeah.
So at the beginning, you said that one of the problems of GDP is that it doesn't show variation. Now, if you make another single value index, you also show variation. Isn't an easy step forward just to learn from statistics and say, instead of representing the mean, we take the median and an error range? Isn't that already? Because I saw you had error bars in one of your plots and I never saw them in the GDP plots. So just to have ranges instead of a single mean value that's very much influenced by some outliers, some very rich people.
So maybe one thing, so unfortunately the error bars there were not about the distribution of the along the individuals, right? That's, I think, so for historians that would be amazing, to be able to do that, but that is well, lots of work to keep us occupied. But unlikely to happen anytime soon. And I think there is some real truth to that, right? So one big step forward would already be to just move from average to the median and report on some quartile ranges as well. But another part of the issue is that there are just aspects of well-being which are just never captured by GDP, right? And then you do sort of end up in the same set of questions, the same set of issues. But for many of these, getting a grip on the distribution is just very interesting. Here they were also reported separately, right? So we had GDP and we had the wages and we also had the income inequality estimates. And every time when you're saying, okay, I want to present it all in one graph, you're losing some information, which is what makes it interesting, but also what makes it hard.
Okay, well, thank you very much. We're a bit over time.